The bullet that grazed Virginia Hadley's shoulder came from her own fiancé's gun, and that was the moment she understood she would have to run for her life through the Arizona desert wearing nothing but her wedding dress. It was the spring of 1881, and the town of Cottonwood Bend sat baking under a sun that showed no mercy to man or beast. Virginia had come west from St. Louis 3 months earlier, answering a letter that promised a respectable marriage to a respectable man, a rancher named Elias Crow who owned land enough to graze 2,000 head of cattle. The letters had been kind. The man himself, she had learned only that morning, standing before the justice of the peace, was not kind at all. He was cruel in the way that men are cruel when they believe no one will ever call them to account for it. And when she had refused, at the very last moment, to sign the marriage paper after seeing him strike one of his own ranch hands across the face for spilling coffee, he had drawn his revolver in front of God and the justice of the peace and half the town, and told her that a woman did not refuse Elias Crow. She had run then, out the back door of the little clapboard church, down through the alley behind the mercantile, past the livery stable, and out into the desert scrub beyond the edge of town, her skirts tearing on the mesquite thorns, her heart hammering louder than her own footsteps. The bullet had only grazed her, a thin line of fire across her shoulder, but it was enough to tell her that Elias Crow meant to finish what he had started. She did not stop running until her lungs burned and her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed in the shade of a rock outcropping some 3 miles from town, blood soaking through the white silk of her wedding dress, turning it the color of dried roses. It was there, in that shade, with the sun sinking low and orange over the distant mountains, that Nathan Underwood found her. He had been riding south along the old smuggler's trail that traced the border between the Arizona Territory and the Mexican state of Sonora, a trail he knew better than any other man alive, because he had walked both sides of that line since he was a boy of 9, when his family had been split by circumstance as cruelly as a river splits a valley. Nathan wore a badge on his vest, a tin star that caught the last light of the day, but it was not the badge of Cottonwood Bend, nor of any town in the Arizona Territory at all. It was the badge of a rural policeman in Sonora, a rural, earned through 5 years of hard riding and harder choices, and it marked him as a lawman on the wrong side of an invisible line that meant everything to some men and nothing at all to the desert itself. He saw the white of her dress first, stark against the red rock, and thought for one terrible moment that he had found a corpse. He swung down from his horse, a rangy buckskin gelding named Diablo that he had raised from a colt, and knelt beside her, and found her breathing, ragged and shallow, her eyes fluttering open to look up at him with a fear that cut him to the bone. "Please," she whispered, "please don't let him find me." "Who?" Nathan asked, already reaching for his canteen, already tearing a strip from his own shirt to press against the wound at her shoulder. "Elias Crow," she said, and the name came out of her like something poisonous she was glad to be rid of. Nathan Underwood's jaw tightened at the name, for he knew it well, had known it for years, in fact, ever since Elias Crow had begun running rustled cattle across the border and selling them to buyers in Sonora who did not ask too many questions about brands. Nathan had chased that trail more than once, only to lose it in the tangle of canyons that marked the borderlands, canyons that belonged to neither country in any way that mattered. "You're safe now," he told her, and his voice was low and steady, a voice built for calming spooked horses and frightened men, and it seemed to work on frightened women too, for she let out a breath she had been holding since the church and closed her eyes and let him lift her onto his horse. "Who are you?" she managed to ask once they were riding, her back against his chest, his arms steady around her. "Nathan Underwood," he said, "rural out of Sonora, and you be the bride that ran, I take it. Word travels fast on the wind out here, even faster than a man with a grudge." "Virginia Hadley," she said, and even in her weakened state, there was a note of pride in the way she said her own name, as though she meant to hold on to it, whatever else might be taken from her that day. I was to be married this morning. Don't look to me like a wedding you wanted, Nathan said. It wasn't, she said, and something in her voice broke just slightly like a thin sheet of ice giving way beneath a boot. My father passed 2 years ago, left debts. Mr. Crow's man came through St. Louis looking for a wife, said he was a respectable rancher, said he'd pay off everything my father owed if I'd come west and marry him. I didn't have much choice in the matter, not really. Not until I saw what kind of man he truly was. Nathan said nothing for a long moment, only guided Diablo down a wash and along a dry creek bed that would hide their tracks better than open ground. He was thinking of his own brother, of Marshal Caleb Underwood, sheriff of Cottonwood Bend, the very town this woman had fled. He was thinking that this business with Elias Crow was about to become a very complicated thing indeed, for Elias Crow was not merely a rancher with a temper. He was a man who had, for 2 years now, been paying certain officials on both sides of the border to look the other way while he moved stolen cattle south and smuggled rifles north, and Caleb had never been able to prove it, not with hard evidence, not enough to hang a man of Crow's standing in the county. I know you're intended, Nathan said finally. Known him longer than I care to admit, and I promise you this, Miss Hadley, I will not let him lay a hand on you again. You hardly know me, she said, though there was no accusation in it, only a kind of wondering. I know enough, Nathan said. I know a woman running through the desert in a wedding dress with a bullet wound in her shoulder didn't do anything to deserve what's chasing her. That's enough for any man with sense to act on. They rode through the gathering dusk toward a lined shack that Nathan kept stocked for exactly this kind of trouble, tucked into a fold of the hills where the border blurred and no one, not the American marshals nor the Mexican rurals, patrolled with any regularity. It was a plain place, one room, a stove, a cot, a shelf of tinned goods and dried beans, but it was safe, and safety was worth more than gold to a woman who had been running for her life only hours before. He tended her wound by lamplight, his hands surprisingly gentle for a man who had spent a decade wearing a gun and riding hard country, and she watched him work with an expression that mixed gratitude with a curiosity that had nothing to do with fear at all. You said you've a brother, she said, as he tied off the bandage. A sheriff. Caleb, Nathan said. My twin. Born 11 minutes apart, though he never lets me forget he was the eldest by those 11 minutes like it means something. Twins, she said, marveling. I'd never have guessed. You wear that badge like you were born to it. I was born to a badge, Nathan said, a wry note entering his voice. Just not the one folks expected. Our father was a Texas Ranger, killed when we were boys, and Caleb always meant to follow in those footsteps. We're a star on this side of the line and make our father proud from whatever corner of heaven he's watching from. Me, I went south instead. Fell in with a good captain of rurals who taught me the trade, taught me the country, taught me that the border ain't half so solid a thing as the men who drew it like to believe. I send Caleb a letter now and then. We meet up when trouble crosses both our jurisdictions, which happens more than folks in Washington or Mexico City would care to admit. And does trouble often look like me? Virginia asked, a small smile finding its way onto her face despite everything, despite the pain in her shoulder and the fear still coiled tight in her chest. Nathan looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight, at the dark hair come loose from its pins, at the eyes that held both terror and a stubborn, burning defiance, and something in his chest shifted, some old lock turning over for the first time in years. No, he said quietly. Trouble usually looks a good deal less like you than trouble ought to. She laughed, a small surprised sound, the first laugh she had managed since the church that morning, and it seemed to loosen something in both of them, some tension that had been drawn as tight as a bowstring since the moment he had found her in the shadow of the rocks. They did not sleep much that night. Nathan kept watch at the door while Virginia lay on the cot, and though exhaustion eventually claimed her, she woke twice with a cry caught in her throat, dreaming of Elias Crow's face twisted with rage, of the sound of the gunshot, and both times Nathan was there at her side within seconds, murmuring words of comfort until she settled back into an uneasy rest. By dawn, he had made his decision, though it was one that would put him squarely between two badges, two countries, and a man with money enough to buy silence on both sides of a border that had never much cared for the truth. "I'm taking you to my brother," he told her, as she ate a breakfast of hardtack and coffee, wincing when the movement of her arm pulled at her stitches. Caleb's got no love for Crow, and if anyone in this territory can hold a man like that to account, it's him. "But I want you to understand something, Miss Hadley. Once we ride into Cottonwood Bend, Crow will know you're alive, and he will not simply let this rest. Men like him don't abide being refused, and they abide even less being humiliated in front of a church full of witnesses." "I understand," Virginia said, and her chin lifted in a way that told Nathan she understood a great deal more about courage than her soft hands and city manners might have suggested. "I have nowhere else to go, Mr. Underwood. My father is gone. My mother passed when I was a girl. There is no one waiting for me back in St. Louis, only more debt and more men like Crow waiting to collect on it in one fashion or another. If I am to face him again, I would rather face him standing than running." Nathan admired that more than he let on. He had known plenty of hard men in his years riding both sides of the border, men who bragged of courage they had never truly tested, and here was a woman who had every reason to flee to the farthest corner of the territory, and instead she meant to stand and fight for the life she wanted, however uncertain that life might be. "Then we'll ride to Cottonwood Bend," he said, "and we'll see justice done, one way or another." The ride to town took the better part of that day, for Nathan kept to back trails and washes, avoiding the main road where Crow's men might be watching, and it was well past noon when they came in sight of the low buildings of Cottonwood Bend, the church steeple and the water tower and the long dusty Main Street lined with false-fronted storefronts. Nathan felt the old familiar tightening in his gut that always came when he crossed into American jurisdiction wearing a Mexican badge. For there were men in every town who saw that star and thought traitor before they thought lawman, no matter how many outlaws he had brought to justice, no matter how many lives he had saved on either side of the line. They found Caleb Underwood in his office, a small building of adobe brick set between the bank and the telegraph office, and when Nathan pushed through the door with Virginia at his side, Caleb rose from his desk so fast his chair nearly toppled. "Lord above," Caleb said, staring at his brother at the woman beside him still wearing the ruined remains of her wedding dress, now covered with a blanket Nathan had given her against the morning chill. "Nathan, what in God's name?" "This is Virginia Hadley," Nathan said, "the bride who ran from Elias Crow's wedding yesterday morning. I expect you've heard something of it." "Heard the whole town's talking of little else," Caleb said, coming around the desk. He was, Virginia noted with some fascination, so like Nathan in feature that she might have mistaken one for the other in a crowd. The same dark hair, the same strong jaw, though Caleb's eyes held a settled steadiness that spoke of a man who had made his peace with staying in one place, while Nathan's held something restless, something that had seen more of the world's hard edges. Crow's told anyone who will listen that his intended was taken against her will, that some border bandit made off with her. Even had the gall to ride out with a posse this morning looking for you, Nathan, though I don't imagine he knew it was you specifically. Just knew some fool had interfered with his plans." "He shot at her, Caleb," Nathan said, his voice hard now, all the warmth gone out of it. "Grazed her shoulder. She's got the wound and the torn dress to prove it, and if that's not enough, there were a church full of witnesses who saw him draw on an unarmed woman." Caleb's face went grim. "Witnesses who'll swear to it. Crow's got half this county in his pocket, one way or another. Men owe him money, owe him favors, and those that don't owe him anything are scared enough of him to keep their mouths shut regardless." "I'll swear to it," Virginia said, stepping forward despite the ache in her shoulder. "I was there. I know what happened. And I know a great deal more besides, Sheriff Underwood, things Mr. Crow let slip in confidence during our courtship by letter, thinking I was too foolish or too desperate to understand what he meant. Things about cattle that don't belong to him crossing into Sonora, about rifles coming back north in the same wagons. Caleb and Nathan exchanged a look that spoke of years of shared history, of a hunt they had both been on, separately and together, for longer than Virginia could guess. "That's the piece we've been missing," Caleb said quietly. "Proof enough to hang a smuggling charge on him, not just a rustling one. If she'll testify to what she knows, and if we can catch him in the act just once more, we might finally have enough to bring him down for good." "I'll testify," Virginia said, without hesitation, though her voice trembled slightly with the weight of what she was offering to do. "I want nothing more than to see that man answer for what he's done, to me and to whoever else has suffered under him." Nathan looked at her with something like awe, and something else too, something warmer and more dangerous to his own careful heart. They spent that afternoon in Caleb's office working out a plan, for a plan was needed, and needed badly, since Elias Crow was not a man who would simply accept defeat and slink away. He owned the largest ranch in the county, employed nearly 30 hands, most of them decent men who worked for wages and knew little of their employer's other business, but at least a dozen of whom were hard cases brought in specifically to move stolen cattle and worse across the border under cover of night. He had, as Caleb had said, friends in low places and high ones both, a deputy customs inspector on the American side who looked the other way for a monthly payment, and on the Mexican side, a comandante of rurals in a neighboring district who did the same, though Nathan's own captain, a proud and incorruptible man named Ramirez, had never taken so much as a peso from Crow's hand. "We need to catch him moving cattle across the line," Nathan said, pacing the small office. "Catch him with the goods in his hands on both sides, so there's no wriggling out of it by claiming jurisdiction confusion, no calling in favors from a bought inspector who will swear the cattle were legitimate stock." "There's a crossing he favors," Caleb said, "below the Whetstone Hills where the arroyo cuts through into Sonora. Used it for 2 years now that we know of, if we had word of when the next drive was planned." "I know when," Virginia said, and both men turned to look at her. "He spoke of it before. Said he meant to move a large herd south within the fortnight, right after our wedding, in fact. Said we'd honeymoon in Tucson while his men handled the business, so as not to trouble my delicate sensibilities with such matters." There was bitterness in the way she said it, the bitterness of a woman who had been treated as an ornament rather than a person, expected to smile and nod and ask no questions. "Fortnight," Caleb said. "That gives us time to prepare, but not much. Crow's not fool enough to keep to a fixed date once he knows you've spoken to us, Virginia. He'll move faster now out of fear, or he'll wait longer out of caution. Either way, we'll need eyes on his ranch." "I can get those eyes," Nathan said. "I've a contact among the vaqueros on the Sonora side, man named Tomas Rivera, works cattle for half the ranches along the border, sees things no lawman ever could. He owes me a favor or two." It was decided then that Nathan would ride back south to make contact with Rivera and with Captain Ramirez, to arrange for rural support on the Mexican side of any crossing, while Caleb would deputize a few trusted men in Cottonwood Bend and keep a discreet watch on Crow's ranch from the American side. Virginia would stay in town, under Caleb's protection, ostensibly recovering from her ordeal at the home of the town's doctor and his wife, good people named Hollies who had no love for Elias Crow and were glad to help hide a frightened woman from his wrath. But before Nathan rode south again, he found a moment alone with Virginia, in the small garden behind the Hollies' house where fig trees offered shade against the relentless afternoon sun. "You don't have to do this," he told her. "Testify, put yourself in more danger than you've already faced. You could go east instead, start fresh somewhere Crow's reach doesn't extend. I'd see you safely to the stage line myself, give you what money I've saved to start over." Virginia looked at him for a long moment, and there was something fierce in her gaze that had nothing to do with fear at all. "Mr. Underwood," she said, I have spent my whole life being moved about like a piece of furniture, first by my father's debts, then by circumstance, then very nearly by a man who thought a wedding ring gave him ownership of my very breath. I am done being moved. I mean to stand here in this territory and see justice done, and if that means facing Elia's crow one more time across a courtroom instead of a church aisle, then that is exactly what I intend to do. Something in Nathan's chest, that old lock that had begun turning the night before, gave way entirely in that moment, and he found himself reaching for her hand before he had quite decided to do so. "Then I'll be there," he said. "However this plays out, Virginia Hadley, I'll be there beside you." She did not pull her hand away. Nathan rode south that evening, crossing the invisible line that meant so much and so little, into the rougher, wilder country of Sonora where cactus grew taller, and the light seemed somehow older, more patient with the passing of centuries. He found Tomas Rivera at a cattle camp 2 days' ride from the border, a wiry, weathered man of perhaps 50 who had known Nathan since he was a green rural of 19, still learning to read tracks and read men in equal measure. "Crow," Rivera said, spitting into the campfire when Nathan explained his purpose. "That one has been trouble longer than you have worn that star, amigo. I have seen his men driving cattle through the whetstone crossing more times than I care to count, always at night, always paying the customs man on both sides to keep his eyes shut tight. You want to catch him at it, finally." "Finally," Nathan agreed. "And I want your help doing it if you're willing. For what he has done to good men trying to make honest wages on this side of the line," Rivera said, "I would help you catch him for nothing more than the pleasure of seeing him hang. But you will owe me a bottle of good tequila regardless when this is finished." "Done," Nathan said, and they shook on it in the old way, the way of men who trusted each other's word above any paper contract. Captain Ramirez proved harder to convince, not because he lacked will, but because he lacked resources. His small detachment of rurals stretched thin across a district larger than some American states. But he agreed at last to send 4 men to the Whetstone Crossing when word came that Crow's herd was moving, provided Nathan could give him at least a day's warning. It took 9 days for that warning to come, 9 days during which Virginia recovered slowly from her wound at the Hollies' house, growing restless with the waiting, growing closer, in small, quiet ways, to Caleb Underwood's steady presence, and through his stories, to the brother who had ridden south again. "He talks of you," Caleb told her one evening, as they sat on the Hollies' porch watching the sun set over the western hills, "more than he's talked of anything in a long while. My brother's not a man given to attachments, Miss Hadley, not since our mother passed and our father before her. He learned young that the desert takes what it wants and asks no permission, and he's kept himself guarded against caring too much for anything that might be taken from him. But something's changed in him these last days. I've known him 30 years, and I know the look of a man whose heart has found something worth the risk of loving." Virginia felt her cheeks warm, though whether from the compliment or the truth of it, she could not entirely say. "He's a good man," she said simply. "Braver than most and kinder than his profession might suggest a man ought to be." "He is that," Caleb agreed. "Always was, even as a boy. Used to bring home every wounded creature he found, birds with broken wings, dogs half-starved and abandoned. Our mother used to say he had a heart too big for his own good, that it would either be his salvation or his ruin, depending on what he chose to love. Word came on the 9th day, carried by a boy on a fast pony who worked as a runner between certain trusted parties in the county, that Crow's herd would move that very night, driven south under cover of darkness toward the Whetstone Crossing. Caleb gathered his deputized men, 4 solid citizens of Cottonwood Bend who had agreed to risk their necks for the sake of law and order, though not without some persuasion and the promise of a share in whatever reward might come from Crow's eventual conviction and the seizure of his ill-gotten wealth. Nathan, who had ridden back north 2 days before, sensing the moment approaching, gathered word to Captain Ramirez by way of a fast rider, and by nightfall, Both sides of the border were converging on the arroyo below the Whetstone Hills. Virginia insisted on coming, despite Caleb's protests, despite Nathan's when he learned of her intention upon his return to town that afternoon. "I've testimony to give," she said, standing her ground in the Hollies' parlor with a stubbornness that would have done credit to any mule in the territory. But testimony given second-hand, after the fact, from a woman who wasn't there to see the crime committed, is a weaker thing than testimony given by a woman who witnessed it with her own eyes. If Crow means to claim in court that no crime occurred at all, that the cattle were his own legitimate stock, I want to be able to say I saw the brands myself, saw them altered, saw the crossing made in secret and in darkness like men with something to hide. "It's dangerous," Nathan said, though he already knew from the set of her jaw that he would not win this argument. "Everything about this has been dangerous since the moment Elias Crow first raised his gun in that church," Virginia said. "I did not run from that danger then, and I do not intend to hide from it now." In the end, they compromised. Virginia would come as far as a ridge overlooking the arroyo, safely back from where any violence might occur, accompanied by 2 of Caleb's deputized men whose sole task would be her protection, while Nathan and Caleb, together with the deputies and, on the Sonora side, Captain Ramirez and his rurals, closed in on the crossing itself. The night was clear and cold, the kind of desert cold that comes swift after sunset and bites through wool coats as easily as through cotton, and the stars above the Whetstone Hills burned bright and close in a way that Virginia, city-raised, had never quite grown accustomed to, even after 3 months in the territory. She lay on her stomach beside a deputy named Wilkes, watching through a borrowed spyglass as the arroyo below filled slowly with the dark shapes of moving cattle, driven by riders who called softly to keep the herd quiet, who clearly understood the value of silence in an enterprise that could not bear the light of day. She counted perhaps 200 head, a fortune in stolen beef, moving steadily toward the invisible line where American soil gave way to Mexican, and she recognized, even at this distance, the broad-shouldered figure riding point, sitting his horse with the easy arrogance of a man who had never once believed the law might catch up to him. Elias Crow himself, come to oversee this crossing personally, perhaps made bold or made careless by his fury at Virginia's escape, and his desire to see this business concluded before any more complications could arise. Below, hidden among the rocks and scrub on the American side of the arroyo, Caleb Underwood raised a hand to signal his deputies into position, while across the invisible line, in the deeper shadow of the Sonora side, Nathan Underwood did the same with Captain Ramirez's rurals, the 2 brothers coordinating an operation that spanned a border neither of them had ever fully believed in, not in their hearts. Not when it came to catching a man who used that border as nothing more than a convenient shield for his crimes. The herd was perhaps a third of the way across when Caleb gave the signal, a sharp whistle that carried on the cold night air, and lanterns bloomed to life on both sides of the arroyo, throwing harsh yellow light across startled cattle and even more startled men. "Elias Crow," Caleb's voice rang out, amplified by the natural echo of the canyon walls. "You're under arrest for cattle theft and smuggling stolen livestock across an international border. Throw down your arms." For a moment, chaos threatened, cattle bawling and shifting in confusion, riders reaching for weapons out of pure animal instinct before their minds caught up to the hopelessness of their position, surrounded as they were on both flanks by armed men in the light of a dozen lanterns. But Elias Crow was, whatever else he might have been, no fool, and he understood in an instant the mathematics of his situation, understood that whatever men he had bought and paid for on either side of the border, none of them extended to this canyon, this night, this moment. "This is an outrage," Crow shouted, though he had already raised his hands, his revolver hanging loose and unfired at his hip. "I own this county, Underwood. You'll answer for this. I expect I'll answer for it in a courtroom, Caleb called back, moving down into the wash with his deputies at his back. Same place you'll be answering for a good deal more than cattle theft, Mr. Crow, once we've had a chance to discuss certain rifles that have been finding their way south in your wagons. It was Nathan who found Virginia on the ridge afterward, once the arrests were made and Crow's men, most of them relieved to be spared any actual gunplay, were being herded toward town under guard, the stolen cattle held in a makeshift corral until their rightful owners across 3 counties could be notified to reclaim their property. You saw it all, he asked her, helping her down from the ridge, his hand warm and steady beneath hers. Every moment, Virginia said. The altered brands, the crossing itself, his own voice giving orders to his men. There will be no denying any of it now. No, Nathan agreed, there won't. He looked at her for a long moment in the lantern light, at the color that had come back into her cheeks despite the cold night air, at the fierce satisfaction in her eyes that had nothing to do with vengeance and everything to do with justice finally served. You did this, he said. Whatever else happens now, whatever the court decides, you're the one who had the courage to see it through. We did this, she corrected him gently. You and your brother and Rivera and Captain Ramirez and every soul who risked something tonight to see a wrong made right. I only provided the piece that was missing. The most important piece, Nathan said. And then, because the night seemed to demand it, because the stars above the Whetstone Hills burned so bright and close, because his heart had been turning steadily toward this woman since the moment he found her broken and bleeding in the desert 9 days before, he kissed her. It was not a long kiss, nor a bold one, but it carried in it everything that 9 days of danger and hope and slowly growing trust had built between them. And when they parted, Virginia's breath came quick and her eyes were bright with something that had nothing to do with fear at all. I've wanted to do that, Nathan admitted, since somewhere around the 2nd day, if I'm honest with myself. I've wanted you to, Virginia said, laughing softly, since somewhere around the 3rd. The trial of Elias Crow took place 3 weeks later in the county seat, a proceeding that drew spectators from every corner of the territory, curious to see a man of such wealth and standing finally brought low. Virginia's testimony proved as damning as she had promised, detailed and unshakable under cross-examination by Crow's expensive lawyer, brought in from Tucson at considerable expense that would soon prove entirely wasted. Combined with the physical evidence of the altered brands, the testimony of Caleb's deputies and Captain Ramirez's rurals, and, most damning of all, the discovery of a ledger in Crow's own hand detailing years of smuggled rifles and stolen cattle, the case against him was airtight. He was convicted on charges of cattle theft, smuggling, and attempted assault against Virginia's own person, and sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison at Yuma, a sentence that seemed to age him a decade in the moment it was pronounced, all his arrogance draining from his face as the reality of his ruin finally settled upon him. His ranch, seized by the territory in payment of his debts and restitution to the ranchers whose cattle he had stolen, was sold at auction, and the corrupt customs inspector who had taken his bribes was dismissed from federal service and faced his own charges shortly thereafter, a small but satisfying additional measure of justice. Virginia Hadley walked out of that courthouse a free woman in every sense of the word, free of debt, for a portion of the proceeds from Crow's seized property went toward settling her father's old obligations, as the court determined she was owed some measure of compensation for the ordeal she had suffered. Free of fear, for the man who had haunted her dreams these past weeks would trouble her no more, locked away behind Yuma's stone walls, and free, most importantly of all, to choose her own path forward, a freedom she had not known since her father's death 2 years before. She chose to stay in Cottonwood Bend. I've nothing to return to in St. Louis, she told Nathan, as they walked together along the main street some days after the trial's conclusion, the desert evening cool and golden around them. No family, no home, no prospects that wouldn't simply repeat the same mistake that brought me west in the first place. But here, I've found something I never expected to find. Friends. Purpose. And you? I've been thinking on that same subject, Nathan said, and there was a nervousness in his voice that seemed almost comical on a man who had faced down armed rustlers and border bandits without so much as a raised pulse. The matter of purpose, I mean. Caleb's spoken of it too. There's talk in Washington, and in Mexico City both, of formalizing cooperation between American marshals and Mexican rurals along the border, given how well our operation against Crow went. They're wanting to establish a joint post, someone who knows both sides of the line, both languages, both sets of law. Caleb's put my name forward for it. That would mean staying here, Virginia said carefully, watching his face. Near Cottonwood Bend instead of riding south to Sonora most of the year. It would, Nathan agreed. And I find myself wanting that, Virginia, wanting it more than I've wanted anything in a long while. Not just the position, though it's honest work and needed work besides, but the staying itself. The chance to build something in one place instead of always riding between two lives that never quite fit together as one. He stopped walking then and turned to face her fully, and Virginia felt her heart quicken at the seriousness in his expression, at the way the last light of the setting sun caught the silver of the badge still pinned to his vest, that tin star that had marked him as a man of two countries and in some hearts of neither. I've never been a man who found it easy to speak of feelings, Nathan said. 10 years of hard riding and hard men will knock the poetry clean out of a fellow, if he ever had any to begin with, which I confess I never did. But I know this much plainly enough. I've never in my life met a woman with your courage, your fierceness in the face of every hardship, and your gentleness besides. For I've seen both sides of you now, Virginia Hadley, the woman who stood her ground against Elias Crow in that arroyo, and the woman who wept softly in the night from wounds both of body and of spirit, and I love you no less for either. I love you entirely, in fact, and I find myself wondering if you might consider building that staying life with me. Virginia's eyes filled with tears, though they were tears of a different nature entirely than any she had shed these past weeks, and she reached up to touch his face, weathered by sun and wind and years of hard living, and found it dearer to her than any smooth-cheeked gentleman she had ever imagined might come courting back in St. Louis. Nathan Underwood, she said, I came west to marry a man I did not love, out of desperation and duty both, and instead I found in the very worst moment of my life, the very best thing that has ever happened to me. Yes, I will build that life with you gladly, and I will consider myself the most fortunate woman in the whole territory for the privilege. They married 2 months later, in that same small clapboard church where Virginia had once stood before a man she feared and refused to marry him. But this time the church was filled not with strangers and false congratulations, but with true friends, Caleb standing as Nathan's best man, Dr. Hollis and his wife beaming from the front pew, Tomas Rivera having ridden 2 days north from Sonora to attend, bringing with him, as promised long ago, a bottle of very good tequila for the celebration afterward. Virginia wore a new dress for this wedding, pale blue instead of white, for she had decided, with a small private smile, that white belonged to a different bride entirely, a woman who no longer existed, who had died somewhere in that desert run and been reborn as someone stronger, someone who chose her own fate rather than having it chosen for her. Nathan Underwood accepted the new joint border post shortly after their wedding, a position that allowed him to work closely with Caleb on matters that spanned both sides of the international line, hunting smugglers and rustlers, and worse, with the full cooperation of both American and Mexican authorities, a cooperation that would, in years to come, prevent no small amount of suffering that might otherwise have gone unchecked in that lawless borderland. He kept his old rural badge, polished and displayed on a shelf in the modest home he and Virginia built on a small parcel of land just outside Cottonwood Bend, alongside the new badge of his joint appointment, twin stars that told the story of a man who had finally found a way to serve two countries and one heart without contradiction. Their life together was not without hardship, for the borderlands never gave up their dangers entirely, and there were nights when Virginia sat awake waiting for Nathan's return from some pursuit or another, her heart in her throat until she heard his horse in the yard and knew him safe. But there was joy too, abundant and hard-won joy, the kind that comes only to those who have known real fear and real loss and understand, therefore, the true worth of safety and love when they finally arrive. Their first child, a son they named Samuel after Nathan's long-dead father, was born the following spring, a sturdy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's fierce, bright eyes, and Nathan wept openly at his birth. A grown man of 31 crying like a boy over the small, perfect weight of his son in his arms, while Virginia, exhausted but glowing, watched with a heart too full for words. A daughter followed 2 years later, whom they named Rosa, in honor of Tomas Rivera's late wife, for Rivera had become something like family to them both, riding north to visit every few months, teaching young Samuel to ride almost before the boy could properly walk, filling their home with stories of the border country and its people, its dangers and its beauty both. Caleb Underwood, for his part, found his own happiness some years later, marrying a schoolteacher named Charlotte who had come west from Boston to teach the growing number of children in Cottonwood Bend, and the two brothers' families became so entwined, living as they did within easy riding distance of one another, that their children grew up more like siblings than cousins, running wild together across the desert hills that had once been the site of such danger, and now held nothing more threatening than the ordinary hazards of childhood adventure. Elias Crow served his full sentence at Yuma, and upon his release, some 14 years after his conviction, he was a broken and much diminished man, all his old arrogance long since ground away by years of hard labor and harder reflection. He left the territory entirely upon his release, moving on to California where, it was said, he lived out his remaining years in obscurity, troubling no one further, a fitting end for a man whose cruelty had once seemed so untouchable and proved, in the end, to be nothing more than the fragile arrogance of a man who had simply never before been made to answer for his sins. Virginia Hadley Underwood, as she came to be known throughout the county, found her own purpose beyond wife and mother both, for her testimony against Crow and her role in his downfall had made her something of a figure of respect and even admiration throughout the territory, and she used that standing, in the years that followed, to advocate for the protection of other women who had come west under similar false promises. Mail-order brides and desperate migrants alike who found themselves trapped in circumstances not of their own choosing. She corresponded with newspapers, spoke before the territorial legislature on more than one occasion, and helped establish a small fund, administered through the church in Cottonwood Bend, to assist women fleeing dangerous or fraudulent marriage arrangements, a fund that would, over the decades that followed, help dozens of women find the same kind of safety and second chance that she herself had found in the shadow of those red rocks so many years before. She never forgot that day, the terror of it, the desperate running, the bullets fire across her shoulder, but she came to think of it in time not as the worst day of her life, but as the hinge upon which her entire life had turned, the door that had closed on one future, cruel and confined, and opened onto another, one she could never have imagined for herself back in St. Louis, filled with a love so steady and so true that she sometimes marveled in quiet moments that she had ever doubted such a thing could exist for her. Nathan Underwood, twin brother to a sheriff, wearer of a rural's badge on what some called the wrong side of the border, found in Virginia Hadley the thing he had never known he was searching for across all those years of hard riding between two countries that never quite felt like home. A reason to stay, a reason to build rather than merely to guard, a love that made sense of every scar and every hard lesson the borderlands had taught him. They lived a long life together in that desert country, watching their children grow and marry and have children of their own, watching the rough frontier town of Cottonwood Bend grow slowly into something more settled, more civilized, though never entirely losing the wild edge that had first brought them together in such dramatic fashion. On summer evenings, when the desert cooled and the stars came out bright and close, as they had on that night at the Whetstone Crossing so many years before, Nathan and Virginia would often sit together on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the western hills in shades of gold and rose, and Nathan would sometimes reach for her hand, the same gesture he had made in the garden behind the Holly's house all those years ago, and Virginia would take it, just as she had then. And they would sit together, in a silence that needed no words to convey the depth of what they had built between them. "Do you ever think on it?" Virginia asked him once many years later when their hair had both gone gray and their children were grown with families of their own. "That day I ran through the desert in my wedding dress. It seems a lifetime ago now, and yet I remember it as clear as yesterday." "I think on it often," Nathan admitted, his weathered hand still strong around hers. "Think on how close a thing it was, finding you when I did. If I'd taken a different trail that day, or ridden an hour later or an hour earlier." "But you didn't," Virginia said. "You found me exactly when you were meant to, and I've thanked whatever Providence arranged it every day since." "As have I," Nathan said, and kissed her softly, there on their porch. Two people who had built a whole life from the wreckage of a terrible morning, who had found in each other something worth every risk they had taken to claim it, something that had grown only stronger and deeper with each passing year, a love as enduring and as steady as the desert stars above them, burning bright against the vast dark sky, unchanged and unchangeable, a fixed point by which any traveler, lost or found, might always steer safely home. And so it was that the sheriff's twin brother, who wore his badge on what some called the wrong side of an arbitrary line drawn across an ancient desert, found that the truest border he ever crossed was the one that led him from a solitary life of duty into a shared life of love, and that Virginia Hadley, who had once fled a wedding in terror, found in the end the very thing that wedding had promised and failed to deliver: a partner worthy of her courage, a home worthy of her hope, and a love story worthy of the wild and beautiful country that had given it birth.